Okay, today I'm going to start off with Cosmos and Psyche, Richard Tarnas, and it's the next section called Forging the Self, Disenchanting the World. Our worldview is not simply the way we look at the world. It reaches inward to constitute our innermost being and outward to constitute the world. It mirrors but also reinforces and even forges the structures, armorings, and possibilities of our interior life. It deeply configures our psychic and somatic experience, the patterns of our sensing, knowing, and interacting with the world. No less potently, our worldview, our beliefs and theories, our maps, our metaphors, our myths, our interpretive assumptions constellate our outer reality, shaping and working the world's malleable potentials in 1,000 ways of subtly reciprocal interaction. Worldviews create worlds. Perhaps the most concise way of defining the modern worldview is to focus on that which distinguishes it from virtually all other worldviews. Speaking very generally, what sets the modern mind apart is its fundamental tendency to assert and experience a radical separation between subject and object, a distinct division between the human self and the encompassing world. This perspective can be contrasted with what has come to be called the primal worldview, characteristic of traditional indigenous cultures. The primal mind does not maintain this decisive division, does not recognize it, whereas the modern mind not only maintains it, but is essentially constituted on it. The primal human being, quote unquote, perceives the surrounding natural world as permeated with meaning whose significance is at once human and cosmic. Spirits are seen in the forest, presences are felt in the wind and the ocean, the river, the mountain. Meaning is recognized in the flight of two eagles across the horizon, in the conjunction of two planets in the heavens, in the unfolding cycles of the moon and sun. The primal world is ensouled. It communicates and has purposes. It is pregnant with signs and symbols, implications and intentions. The world is animated by the same psychologically resonant realities that human beings experience within themselves. A continuity extends from the interior world of the human to the world outside. In the primal experience, what we would call the outer world possesses an interior aspect that is continuous with human subjectivity. Creative and responsive intelligence, spirit and soul, meaning and purpose are everywhere. The human being is a microcosm within the macrocosm of the world, participating in its interior reality and united with the whole in ways that are both tangible and invisible. Primal experience takes place, as it were, within a world soul, an anima mundi, a living matrix of embodied meaning. The human psyche is embedded within a world psyche, in which it complexly participates and by which it is continuously defined. The workings of that anima mundi, in all its flux and diversity, are articulated through a language that is mythic and numinous. Because the world is understood as speaking a symbolic language, direct communication of meaning and purpose from world to human can occur. The many particulars of the empirical world are endowed with symbolic archetypal significance, and that significance flows between inner and outer, between self and world. In this relatively undifferentiated state of consciousness, human beings perceive themselves as directly, emotionally, mystically, consequentially, participating in and communicating with the interior life of the natural world and cosmos. To be more precise, this participation mystique involves a complex sense of direct inner participation, not only of human beings in the world, but also of human beings in the divine powers through ritual, and of divine powers in the world by virtue of their immanent and transformative presence. The participation is multi-directional and multi-dimensional, pervasive and encompassing. By contrast, the modern mind experiences a fundamental division between a subjective human self and an objective external world. Apart from the human being, the cosmos is seen as entirely impersonal and unconscious. Whatever beauty and value that human beings may perceive in the universe, that universe is in itself mere matter in motion, mechanistic and purposeless, ruled by chance and necessity. It is altogether indifferent to human consciousness and values. The world outside the human being lacks conscious intelligence. It lacks interiority, and it lacks intrinsic meaning and purpose. For these are human realities. For these are human realities. And the modern mind believes that to project what is human onto the non-human is a basic epistemological fallacy. The world is devoid of any meaning that does not derive ultimately from human consciousness. From this modern perspective, the primal person conflates and confuses inner and outer, and thus lives in a state of continuous magical delusion, in an anthropomorphically distorted world, a world speciously filled with the human psyche's own subjective meaning. For the modern mind, the only source of meaning in the universe is human consciousness. Another way we might describe this situation would be to say that the modern mind engages the world with an implicit experiential structure of being a subject, set apart from, and in some sense over against, an object. The modern world is full of objects, which the human subject confronts and acts upon from its unique position of conscious autonomy. By contrast, the primal mind engages the world more as a subject embedded in a world of subjects, with no absolute boundaries between or among them. In the primal perspective, the world is full of subjects. The primal world is saturated with subjectivity, interiority, intrinsic meanings, and purposes. From the modern perspective, if I see the world as if it were communicating humanly relevant meaning to me in some purposeful, intelligent way, as if it were laden with meaning-rich symbols, a sacred text, as it were, to be interpreted, then I am projecting human realities onto the non-human world. Such an attitude toward the world is regarded by the modern mind as reflecting an epistemologically naive state of awareness. Intellectually undeveloped, undifferentiated, childish, wishfully self-indulgent, something to be outgrown and corrected through the development of a mature critical reason. Or worse, it's a sign of mental illness, of primitive magical thinking with delusions of self-reference, a condition to be suppressed and treated with appropriate medication. We can illustrate the basic difference between primal and modern experience with a simple diagram, figure 1. Which I will attempt to show. No, hang on, I'll try and bring it up another way. Share the image. So, there we go. Figure 1, and I'm just going to briefly include figures 2 and 3. Whoop, that's the wrong way. Like so, and like so, which I will come back to. So, figure 1, what was he saying about figure 1? He was saying that we can illustrate the basic difference between primal and modern experience with a simple diagram, figure 1, in which the inner circle, representing the primal self, has a porous boundary, suggesting its radical permeability and embeddedness with respect to the world, while the inner circle representing the modern self is formed by a solid line, suggesting the modern experience of a sharp distinction and dichotomy between subject and object, inner and outer. In the primal mind, the shaded area, representing the presence of conscious intelligence and interiority, the source of meaning and purpose, passes without distinction through the entire self-world complex. In the modern mind, the shaded area is located exclusively within the boundary of the self. The systemic recognition the systematic recognition that the exclusive source of meaning and purpose in the world is the human mind, and that it is a fundamental fallacy to project what is human onto the non-human, is one of the most basic presuppositions, perhaps the basic presupposition, of modern scientific method. Modern science seeks with obsessive rigor to de-anthropomorphize cognition. Facts are out there, meanings come from in here. The factual is regarded as plain, stark, objective, unembellished by the human and subjective, undistorted by values and aspirations. We see this impulse clearly evident in the emergence of the modern mind from the time of Bacon and Descartes onward. If the object is to be properly understood, the subject must observe and analyze that object with the utmost care, taken to inhibit the naive human tendency to invest the object with characteristics that are properly attributable only to the human subject. For genuine and valid cognition to occur, the objective world, nature, the cosmos, must be viewed as something fundamentally lacking in all those qualities that are subjectively, inwardly most present to the human mind, as constituting its own being. Consciousness and intelligence, the sense of purpose and intention, capacity for meaning and communication, moral and spiritual imagination. To perceive these qualities as existing intrinsically in the world is to contaminate the act of knowing with what are in fact human projections. It is easy for us today, still under the influence of the modern vision that reifies modern experience and assumptions as absolute, to believe we truly understand the primal vision when we see it as simply the naive consequence of. Let me repeat that. It's easy for us today, still under the influence of the modern vision that reifies modern experience and assumptions as absolute. It's easy for us today to believe we truly understand the primal vision when we see it as simply the naive consequence of primitive fears, wishes, and projections. But to discern more impartially the difference between these two worldviews, we must grasp the stubborn fact that the primal cosmos was universally experienced for countless millennia as tangibly and self-evidently alive and awake, pervasively intentional and responsive, informed by ubiquitous spiritual presences, animated throughout by archetypal forces and intelligible meanings, in a manner that the modern perception does not and perhaps cannot recognize. Of course, this fundamental difference between the primal and the modern did not arise instantly in the 17th century, but evolved over thousands of years in many forms and through many cultural developments. Not just modernity, but the entire human project can be seen as impelling the gradual differentiation between self and world. An emergent distinction between subject and object seems to have been present already at the very birth of Homo sapiens, with its novel capacity and impulse to consciously plan rather than act automatically on instinct, to rely on one's own wits and will to make one's way in the world, to manipulate and control nature rather than be so embedded in it as to be its passive subject. As soon as our species first developed linguistic symbolization, we began to differentiate ourselves further from the world, objectifying our experience in ways that could articulate the world's acting on us and our acting on the world. As soon as we first used a tool, we began to act as a subject vis-a-vis an object. All the epochal advances in human evolution, bipedalism and an upright posture, the larger and more complex brain, the making of tools, the control of fire, the development of hunting and gathering societies, the division of labor, the domestication of plants and animals, the formation of settled communities and then large urban centers, the increasingly complex and hierarchical social organization, the evolving capacities for linguistic, religious, and artistic symbolization, the emergence of the earliest forms of science and philosophy, all these both reflected and impelled new stages in the progressive differentiation of the human self from the encompassing world. A memorable image at the beginning of Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey captures one aspect of this larger coherence in the vector of the human epic. In the opening sequence, entitled The Dawn of Man, a proto-human primate has just made the primordial discovery of using a tool for the first time, successfully employing a large bone as a weapon in a life and death struggle. In the ecstasy of that discovery, he hits the bone over and over again on a rock, on which it eventually shatters, and soaring high into the air, metamorphoses in slow motion into an orbiting space satellite at the turn of the 21st century. In that single montage, we see the entire Promethean trajectory, the alpha and the omega of the Promethean quest to liberate the human being from the bonds of nature for human intelligence and will, to ascend and transcend, to gain control over the larger matrix from which the human being was attempting to emerge. This quest climaxes in modernity, especially in modern science, where the dominant goal of knowledge is ever-increasing prediction and control over an external natural world seen as radically other. Mechanistic, impersonal, unconscious, the object of our powerful knowledge. From the time of Bacon and Descartes, Hobbes and Locke, the more pervasively and more pervasively in the aftermath of the Enlightenment, the modern understanding is gradually so transformed that the world is no longer seen as a locus of pre-given meanings and purposes, as had been true not only in the immemorial primal vision, but also for the ancient Greeks, medieval scholastics, and Renaissance humanists. With the full ascension of the modern mind, the world is no longer informed by numinous powers, gods and goddesses, archetypal ideas, or sacred ends. It no longer embodies a cosmic order of meanings and purposes with which the human self seeks to be aligned. Rather, the world is viewed as a neutral domain of contingent facts and potential means to our secular purposes. In Max Weber's famous term at the beginning of the 20th century, which developed Schiller's insight of a century earlier, the modern world is disenchanted. The modern world is disenchanted. It has been voided of any spiritual, symbolic, or expressive dimension that provides a cosmic order in which human existence finds its ground of meaning and purpose. Instead, the world is viewed entirely in terms of natural facts. The world is viewed entirely in terms of neutral facts, the detached rational understanding of which will give the human being an unprecedented capacity to calculate, control, and manipulate that world. Yet such a great shift in understanding also accomplishes something else of scarcely less importance for the modern self. Disenchantment, the denial of intrinsic meaning and purpose, essentially objectifies the world, and thereby denies subjectivity to the world. Objectification denies to the world a subject's capacity to intend, to signify intelligently, to express its meaning, to embody and communicate humanly relevant purposes and values. To objectify the world is to remove it from all subjective categories, such as meaning and purpose, by perceiving these as projections of what are now regarded as the only true human subjects, human beings. By perceiving these as projections of what are now regarded as the only true subjects, human beings. This, in turn, tremendously magnifies and empowers human subjectivity, the felt interior capacity of the human being to be self-defining, self-revising, self-determining, to be both outwardly world-shaping and inwardly consequential and autonomous. It makes possible a new freedom from externally imposed meanings and orderings that had previously been seen as embedded in the cosmos, and that had typically been upheld and enforced by traditional structures of cultural authority, whether religious, social, or political. Charles Taylor has well described the consequences of this deep shift for the modern self. Quote, one of the powerful attractions of this austere vision, long before it paid off in technology, lies in the fact that a disenchanted world is correlative to a self-defining subject, and that the winning through to a self-defining identity was accompanied by a sense of exhilaration and power, that the subject need no longer define his perfection or vice, his equilibrium or disharmony in relation to an external order. With the forging of this modern subjectivity, there comes a new notion of freedom and a newly central role attributed to freedom, which seems to have proved itself definitive and irreversible. That was Charles Taylor, now back to Tarnas, who says, depriving the world of subjectivity, of its capacity for intentional significance, by objectification and disenchantment, radically enhances the human self's sense of freedom and autonomous subjectivity. Its underlying conviction that it can shape and determine its own existence. Simultaneously, disenchantment enhances the human being's capacity to view the natural world as primarily a context to be shaped and a resource to be exploited for human benefit. As the world loses its traditional structures of pre-given meaning, as these are successively seen through and deconstructed, the conditions of human existence, both outer and inner, become increasingly open to change and development, ever more subject to human influence, innovation, and control. It was through just this extraordinary shift of vision that there developed an effective psychological and philosophical foundation for the rapid ascent of modern science, secular society, democratic individualism, and industrial civilization. The history of the human mind's movement from a state of participation mystique to a more fully differentiated mode of awareness is, in many respects, the history of the human mind itself. Impelled by the powerful human drive to achieve ever greater autonomy relative to the conditions of existence, virtually the entire evolution of human consciousness has served this psychological and epistemological impulse to distinguish the human self from the world, subject from object, part from whole. The Promethean project seems to be intrinsic to the human condition. Yet this project has been carried out most vigorously and brilliantly by the Western mind, above all by the modern mind, that avatar and apex of Promethean progress. If we look again at the comparison, figure 2, between the primal experience of participation mystique and the modern experience of a subject-object dichotomy, we can readily see what has happened in the process of moving from the worldview depicted on the left to that depicted on the right. In the long evolution from primal to modern consciousness, there has taken place a complexly intertwined and interpenetrating two-sided process. On the one hand, a gradual differentiation of the self from the world, of the human being from nature, of the individual from the encompassing matrix of being. On the other hand, a gradual disenchantment of the world, producing a radical relocation of the ground of meaning and conscious intelligence from the world as a whole to the human self alone. What once pervaded the world as the anima mundi, soul of the world, is now seen as the exclusive property of human consciousness. The modern human self has essentially absorbed all meaning and purpose into its own interior being, emptying the primal cosmos of what once constituted its essential nature. But we misunderstand this evolutionary process if we consider it only in the generally secular terms so far discussed. The modern differentiation of the autonomous human self and the disenchantment of the empirical cosmos were also profoundly influenced and even impelled by the historical evolution of religion, again, particularly in the Western context, ancient, medieval, and early modern. From its beginnings, the Western self was informed by the momentous disclosure of humanity's special relationship to a transcendent divine reality, a monotheistic supreme being who was both the creator of the world and the ultimate locus of meaning and value. Quote, man was made in the image of God. Thus, God's absolute uniqueness, separation, and superiority with respect to the mundane world of mortal finitude and unredeemed nature deeply strengthened the human being's sense of uniqueness, separation, and superiority with respect to the rest of nature and the created universe. Modifying our diagram accordingly, we can recognize the crucial intervening stage in the evolution from the primal worldview to the modern one, provided by this immense religious development. With the revelation of a transcendent divine being as the ultimate ground of meaning and value, superordinate to and separate from the empirical world of nature, combined with the human being's unique association with that transcendent divinity, an enormous intellectual and psychological leap is taken in the separative elevation of the human from the, an enormous intellectual and psychological step is taken in the separative elevation of the human from a universe gradually voided of intrinsic meaning. In the monotheistic revelation, a self-subsistent divine subject created the world as object, within which this special human subject and its divinely ordained history unfolds. As the diagram in Figure 3 suggests, and as Descartes' careful arguments for the existence of God at the birth of modern philosophy affirm, what eventually becomes the modern self receives its unique ontological status from its privileged association with the transcendent divine reality that stands above an empirical cosmos that has been increasingly emptied of all inherent significance and value apart from the human. Again, as Figure 3 suggests, what eventually becomes the modern self receives its unique ontological status from its privileged association with the transcendent divine reality that stands above an empirical cosmos that has been increasingly emptied of all inherent significance and value apart from the human. This epochal transformation of the triadic relationship between divinity, humanity, and the world was already set in motion with the emergence of the great world religions and philosophies of transcendence during that period of the first millennium BCE, named by Karl Jaspers the Axial Age. The differentiation between self, world, and God was given special force and new definition with the unfolding of the biblical tradition from the later Hebrew prophets through early Christianity to St. Augustine and the medieval era. It was decisively forwarded and, in a sense, absolutized by the Reformation's militant desacralizing of the world in service of the human being's exclusive allegiance to the sovereign majesty of the Creator. Finally, in the wake of the scientific revolution and enlightenment, this privileged position of the human vis-a-vis the rest of creation was assumed and expanded in entirely secular terms. Here too, partly as a result of forces set in motion by the Western religious legacy, as the modern self progressed in its unprecedented development of autonomy and self-definition. A host of significant complications and exceptions, ambiguities and nuances could be usefully discussed concerning this long and complex historical development. But speaking very broadly, we may say here that as the human self, guided by its evolving cultural, religious, philosophical, and scientific symbolizations, has gained increasing substantiality and distinction with respect to the world, that self has increasingly appropriated all the intelligence and soul, meaning and purpose it previously perceived in the world, so that it eventually locates these realities exclusively within itself. Conversely, as the human being has appropriated all the intelligence and soul, meaning and purpose it previously perceived in the world, it has gained more and more substantiality and distinction with respect to the world, accompanied by ever greater autonomy as those meanings and purposes are seen as ever more malleable to human will and intelligence. The two processes, consolating the self and appropriating the soul of the world, have been mutually supportive and reinforcing. But their joint consequence has been to gradually empty the external world of all intrinsic meaning and purpose. By the late modern period, the cosmos has metamorphosed into a mindless, soulless vacuum within which the human being is incongruently self-aware. The anima mundi has dissolved and disappeared, and all psychological and spiritual qualities are now located exclusively in the human mind and psyche. It appears that this evolutionary trade-off has fostered the emergence of a centered autonomous self, one decisively set off from yet yet dynamically engaged with the encompassing world. A world that in turn has been voided of all those qualities with which the human being is uniquely identified. The forging of the self and the disenchantment of the world, the differentiation of the human and the appropriation of meaning are all aspects of the same development. In effect, to sum up a very complex process, the achievement of human autonomy has been paid for by the experience of human alienation. How precious the former, how painful the latter. What may be viewed as the fundamental epistemological strategy of the evolving human mind, the systemic separation of subject from object, one carried forth to its fullest extent by the modern mind, has proved to be powerfully effective and indeed liberating. Yet many of that strategy's long-term consequences have also proved to be highly problematic. So I'm going to leave that there. I'll add a couple of notes at the end here, which is just to say, Philip K. Dick wrote a really interesting piece called "We Are the Pluriforms of God." We are pluriforms of God. Pluriforms, one word. We are pluriforms of God, which is only 2 pages long and really interesting in this context, which I really recommend looking up. He was essentially talking about this feedback loop of the sort of between the perceived capacity of the self and the perceived capacity to change the world. We might wonder sort of why this development has gone on. Like if we're happy to attribute nature some role in this process. I don't know if all of this move was sort of within human control. It's sort of just that's what happened, you know? And I think from that point of view, it's useful to try and understand why that move is kind of necessary. And I think maybe we're only really able to do that retrospectively from the point of view of the future. A couple of other notes. One of them is that from this diagnosis, I mean, we clearly see the meaning crisis here. It's not just our alienation, but also the anxiety, the absurdity, the loneliness that we feel, the disconnectedness. And that's what Viveki has talked about as the meaning crisis. And we clearly see that the solution, as per Jamie Wheel, for example, in Recapture the Rapture, is to be in the world but not of it. To be in the world but not of it. To realize that we're in a way that there is an aspect of what we are that is in a way divine or sacred, that we do have connection to transcendent divine, but that we're here on Earth with these lives, these bodies, these identities, and um to not resent that the world and its particulars are just as much informing of who we are as some kind of transcendent source. And this is how we get to the prescription for example, ecology of practices through Viveki. It's about recovering our connectedness, recovering our sense that there is a kind of transjectivity, which is between subject and object, between within and without, between the above and the below. The re-ensoulment of the world through that ecology of practices involves bringing our interiority out into shareable contexts. It involves bringing objects and things up into ensoulment and drawing down our abstractions into an ensouled way of life rather than leaving them as kind of lifeless. Mm. Finally, I would say that The Disenchantment of the World is the name of a good book by Morris Berman, Berman. And I wrote a piece called Sky is Mind and Heaven that describes figure 3 in another way. And I'll see if I want to come back to more in Cosmos and Psyche. I think I will.